So first of all, in pursuing this vision of the Spirit in a more tangible way, through language, I'm going to read a few pages about that we might consider to be the doctrine of yoga, or the doctrine of yoga philosophy, before going to the doctrine of the Brahman. This is a statement of the kind of problem that, in understanding a mystical reality, the kind of problem that Newman tells us we have because of the way the mind works. And it also gives us a solution to that problem. So Sri Aurobindo does this at the start of that chapter. He says that we see that there's an infinite, pure status and immobile silence of the Spirit. We see, too, that there is a boundless movement of the Spirit, a power, a dynamic, spiritual, all-containing self-extension of the infinite. Our conceptions foist upon this perception, in itself valid and accurate, an opposition between the silence and status, and the dynamics and movement. So this is an experience that, according to him, we perceive. We perceive the stillness, the immutability, and we perceive the world in its extension. And these are two opposite things. If we're in this, we're not in that, and if we're in that, we're not in this. A solely silent and static infinite, an infinite without an infinite power and dynamics and energy, is inadmissible except as the perception of an aspect. A powerless absolute, an impotent spirit, is unthinkable. An infinite energy must be the dynamics of the infinite. And all power must be the potency of the absolute. An illimitable force must be the force of the Spirit. But the silence, the status, are the basis of the movement. An eternal immobility is the necessary condition. The necessary field, the essence of the infinite mobility. A stable being is the condition and foundation of the vast action of the force of being. It is when we arrive at something of this silence, stability, immobility, that we can base on it a force and energy which in our superficial, restless state would be inconceivable. The opposition we make is mental and conceptual. In reality, the silence of the spirit and the dynamics of the spirit are complementary truths and inseparable. How can we know that? Sri Aurobindo in this chapter says, our finite knowledge, conceptions, standards may be valid within their limits, but they are incomplete and relative. A law founded upon an observation of what is divided in space and time cannot be confidently applied to the being and action of the indivisible. Not only it cannot be applied to the spaceless and timeless infinite, but it cannot be applied even to a time infinite or a space infinite. A law and process binding for our superficial being need not be binding on what is occult within us. Our intellect, founding itself on reason, finds it difficult to deal with what is infra-rational. Life is infra-rational. And we find that our intellectual reason, applying itself to life, is constantly forcing upon it a control, a measure, an artificial Procrustean rule that either succeeds in killing or petrifying life, or constrains it into rigid forms and conventions that lame and imprison its capacity, or end by a bungle, a revolt of life, a decay or disruption of the systems and superstructures built upon it by our intelligence. An instinct, an intuition is needed, which the intellect has not at its command, and does not always listen to when it comes in of itself to help the mental working. But still more difficult must it be for our reason to understand and deal with the supra-rational. The supra-rational is the realm of the spirit. And in the largeness, subtlety, profundity, complexity of its movement, the reason is lost. Here, intuition and inner experience alone are the guide. This intuitive possibility, he says, this is the difference between intuition and intellect. That intuition is born of a direct awareness, while intellect is an indirect action of a knowledge which constructs itself with difficulty out of the unknown from signs and indications and gathered data. But what is not evident to our reason and senses is self-evident to the infinite consciousness. So in this book, And in the Synthesis of Yoga, particularly in these two books, Sri Aurobindo again and again advocates the possibility that if the perceptive faculties, the senses, and the sense mind, and the reasoning intellect are silenced completely, this intuitive, direct grasp of the reality of things becomes possible. And that you have to have faith to undertake that. But there is also the divine force. And that divine force is that ray of intuition, of higher intuition. In Savitri, he's continually saying this, that she is the ray. And if we dwell in the ray, then that intuitive ray allows us to see other realities, other aspects of being. And he says very explicitly that this is the evolutionary pathway for the human being. That higher intuition is a faculty that's already latent in us. And if we allow it to develop, it becomes the key to evolving new faculties as a result of the force that can flow through us if we're not obstructing it with the intellect and the sense mind and the habits of nature. And it's like a methodology which he has laid out repeatedly in these two main works. And there's a whole chapter dedicated to it in this book, but it's mentioned like this periodically. So this is something that Sri Aurobindo inserts everywhere with respect to this notional problem that we have of motionlessness and motion, stillness and action, the Kashara Purusha and the Akashara Purusha. He's constantly inserting these dualities and solving them by the higher intuition. He says our conception of the infinite is formlessness. And we will definitely hear this in the Buddhist doctrine. Formlessness is our conception of the infinite. But everywhere we see form, and forms surrounding us, and it can be and is affirmed of the divine being that he is at once form and the formless. Well, that can only be something that we experience. It can't be something that our mind understands. How can something be form and formless at the same time? The apparent contradiction does not correspond to a real opposition. The formless is not a negation of the power of formation, but the condition for the infinite's free formation. For otherwise there would be a single form, or only a fixity or sum of possible forms in a finite universe. The formlessness is the character of the spiritual essence, the spiritual substance of the reality. All finite realities are powers, forms, self-shapings of that substance. So this is the fundamental Buddhist perception, that the formlessness is the essence of forms. And because of that, forms are infinitely changeable. Because of that, there is time and space. Because the the basic condition for manifestation is formlessness that is a substantial reality. And that formlessness must also be the absolute, unformed, unmanifest, unbound power and beauty and bliss of being. But all of that is in its absolute condition formless. So there are these beautiful lines in Savitri where the eternal child is born in the emptiness, in the nihil. The nihil is the womb of all creation, and everything that is created has that nihil in it as its essence. So why are we so attached to everything? It's the Kashara Purusha that perceives things as if they were bound by time and space and the gunas and energy. The Akashara Purusha steps back and experiences the pure emptiness, and then the Purushottama, the Uttama Purusha, perceives that they're one. That its emptiness is its power to form things infinitely. That is a perception of spirit. Actually, that is a description of a perception of spirit. But when we spiritually perceive that, that is the faculty of what Sri Aurobindo calls the higher intuition. And it's a faculty that we have already available to us if we will but use it. And his writing is meant always to guide us into that resonance with ourselves, that level of ourselves in which we can begin to glimpse the spirit, the spiritual reality, in nature, out of nature, involved in nature, as transcendent, as universal, and as individual. He says, it is Brahman. Well, let me just read several lines here. This, then, is the logic of the way of universal being of Brahman, and the basic working of the reason. Reason actually works like this. It makes all of these distinctions because they exist, but it doesn't see all of the things that it sees as one. It sees them by separating them and analyzing them, and now catching this aspect, now catching that aspect, knowing that all of these things which we have just said are, reasonable. But, so there is a logic and a reason, which in the philosophy of religion is known as the Logos. Everything is like this, because this is the truth of existence, and it is logical. But to know it directly and holistically requires a faculty beyond reason. This is the basic working of the reason, the infinite intelligence of Maya. As with the being of Brahman, so with its consciousness, Maya. Brahman and Maya are one? Isn't that an amazing contradiction? It is not bound to a finite restriction of itself, or to one state or law of its action. It can be many things simultaneously, have many coordinated movements, which to the finite reason may seem contradictory. It is one but innumerably manifold, infinitely plastic, inexhaustibly adaptable. Maya is the supreme and universal consciousness and force of the eternal and infinite Brahman. It is at once transcendental, universal, and individual. It is the soul in us. It is the universal life soul in all things, and it is the unmanifest supreme soul embracing and containing all of that. It is the supreme supracosmic being that is aware of itself as all being, as the cosmic self, as the consciousness force of cosmic nature, and at the same time experiences itself as the individual being and consciousness in all of us. This is not just notional. This is the reality. To our minds, it seems to be notional. But if it is the reality, then it's knowable as such also. And how? Well, Sri Aurobindo has defined that process. Stepping back from the reason, the sense mind, the habits of nature, into the stillness. But in the stillness, as it says in Savitri, all is not lost. It's in a passage in Savitri where her state is described as self-finding through divine self-loss. So that's a challenge, no doubt. Before I read that passage about Brahman, Purusha, and Prakriti, this idea that the stillness contains the knowledge and the power and the action, and that it's realizable, it has been expressed in this passage from the Synthesis of Yoga, which I've quoted in many different lectures because it's so perfect. He says, obeying the necessity to withdraw successively from the practical egoism of our triple nature and its fundamental ego sense, we come to the realization of the spirit, the self, Lord of this individual human manifestation. But our knowledge is not integral if we do not make this self in the individual one with the cosmic spirit and find their greater reality above in an inexpressible but not unknowable transcendence. This cannot be done without an uncompromising abolition of the ego sense at the very basis and source. In the path of knowledge, one attempts this abolition negatively by a denial of the reality of the ego. Positively, by a constant fixing of the thought upon the idea of the one and infinite in itself, or the one and infinite everywhere. This is what he refers to as universalization of consciousness. We can see everywhere, in each of us, in all our activities and everything around us, all the time, nature, prakriti. And we can see it as that, not as this person and this feeling and that feeling and this ambition and that failure and this success, but just see it all as one field, very diverse, of prakriti. This is an activity that the mind can perform successfully. It can universalize itself. This, he says, to see the one and infinite everywhere, and not everything else. Just that. This, if persistently done, changes, in the end, the mental outlook on oneself and the whole world, and there is a kind of mental realization. But afterwards, by degrees, or perhaps rapidly and imperatively and almost at the beginning, the mental realization deepens into spiritual experience. You are that one in everything. A realization in the very substance of our being. More and more frequent conditions come of something indefinable and illimitable. A peace, a silence, a joy, a bliss beyond expression, a sense of absolute impersonal power, a pure existence, a pure consciousness, an all-pervading presence. The ego persists in itself or in its habitual movements, but the place of the one becomes more and more loosened. The others are broken, crushed, more and more rejected, becoming weak in their intensity, limp or mechanical in their action. In the end, there is a constant giving up of the obscuring impurity of our outward nature. No, there is a persistent giving up of the whole consciousness into the being of the Supreme. In the beginning, when the restless confusion and obscuring impurity of our outward nature is active, when the mental, vital, physical, ego sense are still powerful, this new mental outlook, these experiences may be found difficult in the extreme. But once that triple egoism is discouraged or moribund, and the instruments of the spirit are set right, the intuitive consciousness, the vast inner peace, and purified in an entirely pure, silent, clarified, widened consciousness, the purity, the infinity, the stillness of the one reflects itself like the sky in a limpid lake. obeying the necessity to withdraw successively from the practical egoism of our triple nature. So this is yoga, and this is how Sri Aurobindo defines yoga repeatedly, and this is yoga. Nothing else is yoga, according to Sri Aurobindo. This and nothing else is yoga. So, from that status of perception of the soul in nature, the soul freed from nature, and the soul as the creative energy of the Brahman, there comes this integral vision of the Trinity. This is Sri Aurobindo's doctrine of the Brahman. That this is his synthesis of all of those attempts by Hindu doctrine to express the reality of the spirit. Are we ready? Would you like to have tea first? Because I'm going to read a passage from Savitri which communicates this mantrically. But first I want to read the prose version of it. And what we should be able to see then is three levels of the consideration, the expression of this aspect of reality. We heard the sort of intellectual description. We've heard and will continue to hear an inspired notional expression of it, and then we will hear the mantric pure revelation.